Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we delve into a case that shocked investigators not just for its brutality, but for the way social media became both the weapon and the evidence that brought a killer to justice. This is the story of Amanda Taylor, a young woman whose quest for attention led her down a path of unthinkable violence. Our story begins in the quiet, rural landscapes of Montgomery County, Virginia, where the small unincorporated community of Ellet sits nestled among rolling hills and sparse farmland. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where life moves at a gentler pace, and where violent crime is almost unheard of. But in the spring of 2015, this peaceful community would become the backdrop for one of the most disturbing murder cases Virginia had seen in years. Amanda Taylor was 24 years old, a young woman who had experienced more loss and trauma than many people twice her age. She had been married to Rex Taylor, a man who struggled with demons that would ultimately consume him. Rex battled prescription drug addiction, a fight he waged alongside his father, Charles Taylor. The two men had become bonded not just by blood, but by their shared dependency on pills that promised relief but delivered only more pain. Rex Taylor was a man caught between worlds. He loved Amanda deeply, but his addiction created a barrier between them that grew thicker with each passing day. His father, Charles, 59 years old and living in the small community of Ellet, was both his companion in addiction and, in Amanda's eyes, his enabler. Charles was known in the community as a kind and generous man, someone who would help a neighbor without question and never ask for anything in return. But behind closed doors, he and his son shared a dangerous habit that would ultimately destroy both their lives. The relationship between Amanda and Charles was complicated from the beginning. She saw him as the person responsible for introducing her husband to the pills that would eventually kill him. In her mind, Charles wasn't just an enabler, he was the architect of her husband's destruction. This resentment would fester and grow, feeding on itself until it became something far darker than simple anger. In 2014, Amanda's world collapsed when Rex took his own life. The young woman was devastated, consumed by grief that quickly transformed into something more dangerous, rage. She couldn't accept that her husband had chosen to leave her. Instead, she needed someone to blame, someone to hold accountable for the loss that had torn her world apart. In Amanda's mind, the equation was simple: Charles had introduced Rex to drugs, Charles had enabled his addiction, and therefore Charles was responsible for Rex's death. It didn't matter that addiction is a complex disease, that many factors contribute to someone's decision to end their life. Amanda needed a target for her rage, and Charles Taylor became that target. The months following Rex's death were difficult for Amanda. She struggled to process her grief, to find meaning in a world that suddenly felt empty and purposeless. She spent hours on social media, crafting posts about her loss, seeking sympathy and attention from her online followers. The digital world became her refuge, a place where she could control the narrative of her life and receive the validation she desperately craved. But validation wasn't enough. The anger continued to build inside her, fed by sleepless nights and endless rumination about the man she held responsible for her husband's death. Charles Taylor was still alive, still breathing, while her beloved Rex lay cold in the ground. In Amanda's twisted logic, this seemed fundamentally unfair. By early 2015, Amanda's thoughts had moved beyond simple anger and resentment. She began to fantasize about revenge, about making Charles pay for what she believed he had done. These weren't just passing thoughts of anger, they were detailed plans that grew more elaborate and violent with each passing day. Amanda found an ally in Sean Edward Ball, a 32-year-old man who became drawn into her world of rage and revenge. Sean was someone who lived on the margins of society, a person who found excitement in dangerous situations and illegal activities. When Amanda shared her plans for revenge against Charles Taylor, Sean didn't try to talk her out of it. Instead, he offered to help. The two began to plan what they would later describe as a crime spree. Charles Taylor would be just the beginning, they decided. After dealing with him, they would continue their violent journey, targeting others who they felt had wronged them or society in general. In Amanda's mind, this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about making a statement, about getting the attention and recognition she felt she deserved. The plan was relatively simple in its brutality. They would drive to Charles's home in Ellet, confront him about his role in Rex's death, and then kill him. Amanda had already decided that she would be the one to wield the knife, to personally exact her revenge on the man she held responsible for destroying her life. The morning of April 4, 2015, dawned clear and cool in Montgomery County. Charles Taylor went about his normal routine, unaware that this would be the last day of his life. He had no reason to expect trouble. Amanda hadn't been in contact with him since Rex's death, and their relationship, while strained, had never been openly hostile. Sean Ball picked up Amanda early that day, and together they made the drive to Charles's home. The house sat on a quiet road, surrounded by trees and set back from the main thoroughfare. It was the kind of place where someone could live peacefully, where neighbors respected each other's privacy, and where violence was almost unimaginable. Amanda carried with her more than just a knife that day, she carried months of accumulated rage, a twisted sense of justice, and a desperate need for attention that had grown into something monstrous. She had already decided that this wouldn't be a private act of revenge. This would be something she shared with the world, something that would finally get her the recognition she craved. When they arrived at Charles's home, Amanda didn't hesitate. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, played out different scenarios and conversations. But when the moment came, there was no lengthy confrontation, no dramatic speeches about justice or revenge. There was only violence. Amanda attacked Charles with a fury that shocked even Sean Ball. She stabbed him multiple times, each thrust of the knife fueled by months of pent-up anger and resentment. Charles, caught completely off guard by the attack, had no chance to defend himself. The 59-year-old man who was known for his kindness and generosity died brutally in his own home, killed by the woman who had once been his daughter-in-law. But Amanda wasn't finished. In what would become the most shocking aspect of an already horrific crime, she took out her cell phone and began taking pictures. She posed next to Charles's lifeless body, holding the bloody knife that had just ended his life. The photos were grotesque, a young woman smiling and posing as if she were at a tourist attraction, with a murder victim serving as her backdrop. What happened next would forever change how law enforcement viewed the role of social media in criminal investigations. Amanda didn't just take the photos for her own satisfaction, she immediately began posting them online. She uploaded the images to Instagram, Facebook, and other platforms, along with detailed captions explaining what she had done and why. "Everything I did was for the right reasons," she wrote in one post. "I stabbed my father-in-law to death because he destroyed my husband. I wasn't the perfect wife, but this was one last good thing I could do." The posts were accompanied by hashtags and comments that revealed Amanda's desperate need for attention and validation. She called herself the Brunette Bomber, creating a moniker that she hoped would make her infamous. She talked about feeling relief after killing Charles, about how good it felt to finally get revenge for her husband's death. But Amanda didn't stop with just posting to her own social media accounts. She actively sought out crime bloggers and websites dedicated to serial killers and violent criminals. She sent her selfies to these sites, hoping they would feature her story and make her famous. In her twisted mind, she had done something noteworthy, something that deserved recognition and praise. One crime blogger who received Amanda's photos immediately recognized them for what they were, evidence of a real murder. Instead of posting them for entertainment, the blogger contacted law enforcement. Within hours, police had the images and were beginning their investigation. The photos were so clear, so detailed, that they left no doubt about what had happened. Amanda had essentially provided law enforcement with a complete confession, documented proof of her crime, and even her location at the time of the murder. She had made their job incredibly easy, but she had also revealed something deeply disturbing about her mental state and her motivations. When police arrived at Charles Taylor's home, they found a scene that matched exactly what they had seen in Amanda's social media posts. The 59-year-old man lay dead, stabbed multiple times, just as depicted in the photos. The crime scene was brutal and senseless, made even more disturbing by the knowledge that the killer had posed for pictures with her victim. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office had ever handled. They had a confessed killer who had documented her own crime, provided photographic evidence, and even explained her motives in writing. It should have been a simple case to close, but Amanda's behavior continued to escalate in ways that surprised even experienced investigators. Captain Randy New, who led the investigation, would later describe Amanda's actions as the work of someone who was evil personified. The casual way she had posed with her victim, the pride she seemed to take in her actions, and her desperate attempts to gain fame from her crime all painted a picture of someone who was fundamentally different from other killers they had encountered. But Amanda and Sean weren't finished with their crime spree. After leaving Charles's home, they hit the road with plans to continue their violent journey. Amanda posted updates on social media as they traveled, describing their plans to kill more people and her excitement about becoming famous for her crimes. The manhunt that followed stretched across multiple states as law enforcement agencies worked together to track down the pair before they could kill again. Amanda's constant social media updates actually helped investigators follow their trail, as she continued to post location information and photos of their journey. Amanda's need for attention and validation ultimately led to her downfall. Her constant posting on social media provided law enforcement with a real-time tracking system, allowing them to follow her movements and predict where she might go next. She seemed oblivious to the fact that her digital footprints were leading police directly to her location. The chase came to an end when Amanda and Sean were apprehended before they could carry out any additional attacks. Amanda's reaction to her arrest was telling. She seemed almost excited by the attention she was receiving, thrilled that her actions had made her the center of a major criminal investigation. During her initial interviews with police, Amanda showed no remorse for killing Charles Taylor. Instead, she seemed proud of what she had done, viewing it as justified revenge for her husband's death. She spoke about feeling relieved after the murder, about how it had given her a sense of closure and satisfaction that she had been seeking since Rex's suicide. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed a young woman who was desperate for attention and recognition, someone who felt invisible and unimportant until she committed an act of extreme violence. Amanda had found in murder the fame and notoriety that had eluded her in life, and she seemed genuinely pleased with the trade-off. When Amanda Taylor's case went to trial, it was clear that the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence against her was overwhelming: her own social media posts, the photographs she had taken, and her detailed confessions had created an airtight case for prosecutors. What was remarkable about the trial wasn't the verdict, but how quickly the jury reached their decision. After hearing the evidence, including the disturbing photographs and social media posts, the jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before finding Amanda guilty of first-degree murder. It was one of the shortest deliberations in Montgomery County history for such a serious crime. The judge who sentenced Amanda to life in prison without the possibility of parole called her evil personified, words that captured the revulsion many people felt about her actions. The casual way she had posed with her victim, her pride in her crime, and her desperate attempts to gain fame from murder had created a case that was uniquely disturbing even by criminal justice standards. Sean Ball, who had accompanied Amanda on her crime spree, was also convicted and sentenced for his role in Charles Taylor's murder. However, it was clear to everyone involved that Amanda had been the driving force behind the crime, the one whose need for revenge and attention had led to an innocent man's death. While Amanda Taylor achieved the infamy she had sought, the real victims of her actions were the families left behind to deal with the aftermath of her violence. Charles Taylor's family struggled to understand how someone could commit such a brutal act against a man who was known for his kindness and generosity. The Taylor family also had to deal with the unique horror of knowing that their loved one's murder had been turned into entertainment by his killer. The photographs Amanda had taken and shared online continued to circulate on social media and crime websites, creating a lasting trauma for those who had cared about Charles. Rex Taylor's mother, devastated by the loss of her son and then the murder of her ex-husband, found herself dealing with unwanted attention from crime enthusiasts and media outlets interested in the case. She had lost two important people in her life, and now had to watch as one became the subject of true crime entertainment and social media fascination. The case also raised important questions about the role of social media in modern crime and the responsibility of platforms to monitor and respond to violent content. Amanda's posts had remained online for hours before being reported, during which time they were viewed and shared by numerous people who seemed to treat them as entertainment rather than evidence of a real crime. Mental health experts who studied Amanda Taylor's case found it to be a disturbing example of how social media and the desire for fame could combine with grief and anger to create something truly dangerous. Amanda wasn't psychotic or delusional. She knew exactly what she was doing when she killed Charles Taylor. Her actions were calculated and deliberate, driven by a toxic combination of revenge and narcissism. The photographs she took after the murder weren't spontaneous decisions made in the heat of the moment. They were planned actions designed to create maximum impact and attention. Amanda had thought about how she wanted to present herself to the world, how she wanted her crime to be perceived, and how she could use violence to achieve the recognition she craved. What made Amanda's case particularly disturbing to mental health professionals was her complete lack of remorse or empathy for her victim. She spoke about Charles Taylor as if he were an object rather than a human being, someone who existed solely to be the target of her revenge. This dehumanization of her victim was necessary for Amanda to carry out her plan and to feel justified in her actions. The role of social media in Amanda's psychology couldn't be overstated. The platforms that had once provided her with attention and validation for mundane life events had created an expectation that extreme actions would generate even more engagement. In her mind, murder was simply the ultimate content, the one thing guaranteed to make her famous. Amanda Taylor's case became a landmark example of how the digital age had changed the nature of crime and criminal investigation. Never before had a killer provided such detailed documentation of their own actions, creating a complete record of their crime from planning through execution to aftermath. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied Amanda's case to better understand how social media could be used both as a tool for criminals and as evidence for prosecutors. The immediate availability of her confessions and photographic evidence had made the investigation remarkably straightforward, but it had also revealed new challenges in dealing with criminals who used digital platforms to amplify their crimes. The case also highlighted the responsibility of social media users who encounter violent content online. Several people had seen Amanda's posts before they were reported to authorities, raising questions about when witnessing a crime online creates a moral obligation to contact law enforcement. Crime bloggers and websites dedicated to violent content also faced scrutiny after Amanda's attempts to submit her photos for publication. While most responsible sites had policies against publishing content that could glorify or encourage violence, Amanda's case revealed the complex ethical issues surrounding true crime entertainment in the digital age. Today, Amanda Taylor remains in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. She achieved the infamy she sought, but at the cost of her freedom and the life of an innocent man. Her case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals as an example of how the desire for attention and social media validation can contribute to violent crime. The selfie killer moniker that Amanda had hoped would make her famous has indeed stuck, but not in the way she might have imagined. Rather than being celebrated as some kind of criminal mastermind, she is remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of narcissism, social media obsession, and the lengths some people will go to for attention. Charles Taylor's death serves as a reminder that behind every true crime story is a real human being whose life was cut short by senseless violence. He was a man who had struggles with addiction, but who was also described by those who knew him as kind and generous. His death was not justified by Amanda's grief or her need for revenge, and his memory deserves to be honored apart from the circumstances of his murder. The case also serves as a warning about the ways that grief and anger can be transformed into something destructive when combined with narcissism and a desperate need for attention. Amanda Taylor's story might have been different if she had sought help for her emotions after her husband's death, if she had found healthy ways to process her grief instead of allowing it to transform into murderous rage. As we conclude this story, it's important to remember that true crime is not entertainment, it's the documentation of real human tragedy and loss. Amanda Taylor's case is disturbing not just because of the violence she committed, but because of what it reveals about the potential for social media and the desire for fame to corrupt and destroy human empathy. The photographs Amanda took after murdering Charles Taylor will forever serve as a reminder of how far someone can fall when they prioritize attention and validation over human life and basic morality. Her selfies captured not just a moment of violence, but the complete absence of remorse or humanity in someone who had lost her way so completely that murder seemed like a reasonable path to fame. In our connected world, where social media provides instant access to global audiences and the potential for viral fame, Amanda Taylor's story serves as a dark warning about the dangers of seeking validation through increasingly extreme actions. Her case reminds us that behind every shocking headline and viral post is a real person whose actions have real consequences for real victims and their families. The quiet community of Ellet, Virginia, where Charles Taylor lived and died, has largely returned to its peaceful existence. But the memory of what happened there in April 2015 serves as a permanent reminder that violence can intrude into even the most peaceful places, carried by people whose need for attention has overcome their basic humanity. Amanda Taylor got what she wanted, her name is known, her story has been told countless times, and she achieved the infamy she sought. But the cost was the life of an innocent man and her own freedom, a trade that serves as a stark reminder of how the pursuit of fame and attention can lead to the destruction of everything that truly matters in life. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The summer of 2017 was supposed to be a time of freedom and possibility for 12-year-old Naomi Jones. Like many children her age, she was looking forward to the long, warm days ahead in Pensacola, Florida, where the Gulf Coast breeze carries promises of adventure and the simple pleasures of childhood summers. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments can become the last threads connecting us to everything we hold dear. Naomi lived with her family at the Aspen Village apartment complex on East Johnson Avenue, a modest community where neighbors knew each other by name and children played in the courtyard until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where a mother could feel reasonably safe letting her daughter step outside their front door, where the familiar rhythms of everyday life created an illusion of security that many of us take for granted. On the evening of May 31, 2017, that sense of security would be shattered forever. Naomi was a bright, spirited girl who had just finished her school year. Like most 12-year-olds, she was caught between childhood and adolescence, still young enough to find wonder in simple things, yet old enough to crave a bit of independence. Her mother, Shantara Hurry, had watched her daughter grow into a thoughtful, caring child who brought light into every room she entered. That Wednesday evening began like countless others. The sun was setting over Pensacola, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Families were settling in for the night, the sounds of dinner preparations and television programs drifting through open windows. It was the kind of peaceful evening that makes you grateful for the quiet moments in life. But somewhere in that ordinary evening, something went terribly wrong. Naomi disappeared from her home that night, vanishing without a trace into the warm Florida darkness. When morning came and her bed remained empty, when her usual morning routines went unobserved, the realization hit her family with devastating force: Naomi was gone. The initial hours of a missing child case are always the most crucial, and they're often the most agonizing for families. Hope and terror walk hand in hand as every minute stretches into eternity. Shantara Hurry found herself thrust into every parent's worst nightmare: the not knowing, the desperate searching, the mounting fear that grows with each passing hour. The Escambia County Sheriff's Office responded immediately, understanding the urgency that surrounds any missing child case. Sheriff David Morgan, a veteran law enforcement officer who had seen his share of difficult cases, knew that time was not on their side. The first 24 hours would be critical. Within hours, the story of Naomi's disappearance had spread throughout the Pensacola community. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through neighborhoods, parks, and wooded areas. Her photograph appeared on social media feeds and local news broadcasts, a smiling 12-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her, now the subject of an urgent plea for help. The investigation began to focus on the Aspen Village apartment complex where Naomi lived. Detectives canvassed the area, speaking with neighbors, reviewing security footage where available, and trying to piece together a timeline of that fateful evening. They were looking for anything: a witness who had seen something unusual, a detail that might provide a clue about what had happened to Naomi. The apartment complex was home to various residents, including transient tenants and people with complicated backgrounds. This wasn't uncommon in many apartment communities, but it added layers of complexity to the investigation. Detectives had to carefully examine the lives and histories of numerous individuals who lived in or frequented the area. As the search continued, the community rallied around Naomi's family with remarkable dedication. Volunteers printed flyers, organized search teams, and spread the word far beyond Pensacola's borders. Social media became a powerful tool, with Naomi's story reaching thousands of people who had never met her but were moved by the desperate search for a missing child. But even as hope persisted, investigators were beginning to fear the worst. Missing child cases that extend beyond the first day rarely have happy endings, though no one wanted to voice that terrible possibility aloud. Days passed with agonizing slowness. June 1st came and went, then June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Each sunset brought another night that Naomi wouldn't be coming home, another morning that would dawn without her presence. The search continued, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Then, on June 5, 2017, 5 days after Naomi first went missing, the worst fears were realized. It was late in the afternoon when the call came in. Someone had spotted something in 8 Mile Creek, a waterway that winds through Escambia County. The location was on Ashland Avenue near Detroit Street, several miles from where Naomi had disappeared. The responding officers found what every searcher had dreaded finding. Naomi Jones had been located, but she would never be coming home again. Sheriff David Morgan held a press conference that evening, his somber demeanor telling the story before he spoke a single word. The community that had held its breath for 5 days now exhaled in collective grief and horror. The bright, spirited 12-year-old who had captured hearts across the region was gone, the victim of what authorities immediately classified as a homicide. The discovery of Naomi's body marked the end of one terrible chapter and the beginning of another. The desperate search for a missing child had become a murder investigation, and now the focus shifted to finding the person responsible for this unthinkable crime. Investigators processed the scene with painstaking care, knowing that every piece of evidence could be crucial in building a case against Naomi's killer. The location where her body was found, 8 Mile Creek, would become a key element in understanding what had happened during those 5 missing days. The autopsy would later reveal that Naomi had died from asphyxiation, though the exact circumstances remained unclear initially. What was immediately apparent was that a child had been murdered, and someone in the community was responsible for this horrific act. Within days of finding Naomi's body, investigators made a breakthrough. Their attention turned to a man named Robert Letroy Howard, a 43-year-old with a criminal history that included sex offenses. Howard was not a resident of the Aspen Village apartments, but he had connections there, connections that would prove to be deadly. Robert Howard had been frequenting the apartment complex because he was in a relationship with a woman who lived there. This gave him regular access to the building and familiarity with its layout, residents, and routines. He would have known about the comings and goings of families like Naomi's, would have observed the daily patterns that make up the fabric of apartment complex life. Howard's background made him a person of immediate interest to investigators. He had previous convictions for sex offenses in Alabama, marking him as someone who had already crossed lines that most people would never approach. This criminal history suggested a pattern of predatory behavior that made him a viable suspect in Naomi's murder. On June 7, 2017, just 2 days after Naomi's body was discovered, Robert Howard was arrested and charged with her kidnapping and murder. Sheriff Morgan held another press conference, this time with a different message for the community. "We found our monster," he announced, his words carrying both relief and determination. But arresting Howard was only the beginning of what would become a long journey toward justice for Naomi and her family. Building a murder case requires more than suspicion or even a criminal history. It requires evidence, witnesses, and a narrative that can convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation into Howard's activities on May 31, 2017, began to paint a disturbing picture. Prosecutors would later argue that Howard had kidnapped Naomi with the intention of sexually assaulting her, and then murdered her to cover up his crime. This theory fit the pattern of his previous offenses and provided a motive for the killing. But proving what happened during those crucial hours required careful detective work. Investigators had to trace Howard's movements, examine potential evidence from his vehicle and residence, and build a timeline that would demonstrate his guilt in court. The case against Howard relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and his own eventual confession. During interrogation, Howard initially denied involvement in Naomi's disappearance and death. But under sustained questioning, his story began to change and evolve in ways that suggested deception. Eventually, Howard admitted to killing Naomi, though his version of events differed from what prosecutors believed had actually occurred. In his confession, Howard claimed that he had strangled the 12-year-old girl after an argument at his apartment, then disposed of her body by throwing it from a bridge into 8 Mile Creek. This confession provided investigators with crucial information about how Naomi had died and where her body had ended up, but it also raised questions about Howard's credibility and the full extent of what had happened to her during her final hours. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch over several years, as Howard's defense team worked to challenge the evidence against him while prosecutors built their case for first-degree murder. During this time, Naomi's family endured the additional trauma of a prolonged legal battle, reliving the worst moments of their lives through court proceedings and media coverage. The trial, when it finally began in August 2021, more than 4 years after Naomi's death, brought together all the evidence that investigators had gathered. More than a dozen witnesses testified about various aspects of the case, from Naomi's disappearance to the discovery of her body to Howard's behavior and statements during the investigation. Medical examiners testified about their findings during the autopsy, confirming that Naomi had died from asphyxiation. This testimony was crucial in establishing the cause of death and supporting the prosecution's theory about what had happened to her. The defense argued that while Howard may have killed Naomi, the circumstances didn't support a first-degree murder conviction. They suggested that the death might have been the result of a different scenario than what prosecutors claimed, potentially opening the door to lesser charges. But prosecutors, led by Chief Assistant State Attorney Bridget Jensen, argued forcefully that Howard had kidnapped Naomi with the intention of sexually assaulting her, then murdered her to prevent her from reporting the crime. This premeditation was key to securing a first-degree murder conviction. The evidence presented during the trial included Howard's confession, forensic evidence from the scene where Naomi's body was found, testimony about his behavior during the investigation, and evidence of his previous criminal history. Prosecutors also highlighted the fact that Howard had been found with one of the missing person flyers for Naomi in his car, suggesting his awareness of the search efforts. During the trial, attorneys showed the jury surveillance footage that captured movements in the area during the time frame when Naomi disappeared. These timestamps, ranging from approximately 2:21 a.m. to 2:53 a.m., helped establish when the crime may have occurred and when Howard's vehicle was in the vicinity. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the interrogation video in which Howard eventually confessed to killing Naomi. In this recording, played for the jury, Howard admitted to choking the 12-year-old girl to death and disposing of her body in the creek. The trial also revealed the extensive search efforts that had been undertaken to find Naomi, including the mobilization of volunteers, law enforcement resources, and community support. This testimony helped illustrate the impact of her disappearance on the broader Pensacola community and the desperate efforts to bring her home safely. On August 12, 2021, after hearing closing arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. The weight of the evidence, including Howard's confession and the circumstances surrounding Naomi's death, ultimately convinced them of his guilt. The following day, August 13, 2021, the jury returned with their verdict. Robert Letroy Howard was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of 12-year-old Naomi Jones. The conviction carried an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Naomi's mother, Shantara Hurry, the guilty verdict represented a measure of justice for her daughter, though nothing could truly fill the void left by Naomi's death. Speaking after the trial, she reflected on the long journey from her daughter's disappearance to Howard's conviction, describing it as a battle that no parent should ever have to fight. The case also highlighted broader issues about community safety and the challenges of protecting children from predators who may be living among us. Howard's ability to access the apartment complex where Naomi lived, despite his criminal history, raised questions about background checks and security measures in residential communities. In 2020, Naomi's family reached a settlement in a wrongful death lawsuit against the apartment complex, arguing that inadequate security had contributed to the tragedy. Shantara Hurry expressed hope that the legal action would prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies in the future. The murder of Naomi Jones serves as a sobering reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of remaining vigilant about the people in our communities. It also demonstrates the dedication of law enforcement officers and community members who refuse to give up in the search for justice. Today, Robert Howard remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence for the murder of Naomi Jones. He will never again have the opportunity to harm another child, a small comfort for those who knew and loved Naomi. But Naomi's story is more than just a crime and its resolution. It's also a story about a bright, spirited 12-year-old girl who brought joy to everyone who knew her. It's about a community that came together in the face of tragedy, refusing to let her disappearance go unnoticed or uninvestigated. It's about a mother's love and determination to seek justice for her daughter. In the years since Naomi's death, her mother has become an advocate for child safety and victims' rights, working to ensure that her daughter's legacy includes positive changes that might protect other children. This work represents a way of channeling grief into purpose, of finding meaning in the aftermath of senseless tragedy. The investigation and trial of Robert Howard also showcased the importance of thorough police work and the dedication of prosecutors who refuse to let crimes against children go unpunished. The 4-year journey from arrest to conviction demonstrated that justice, while sometimes slow, can ultimately prevail. As we reflect on Naomi's story, we're reminded of the preciousness of childhood and the responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities. We're also reminded that behind every crime statistic is a real person, in this case, a 12-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short, whose potential will never be realized, whose laughter will never again fill her family's home. The summer of 2017 was supposed to be a time of possibility for Naomi Jones. Instead, it became the setting for a tragedy that would forever change her family and community. But through the pursuit of justice and the preservation of her memory, Naomi's story continues to have meaning and impact. In the quiet moments before sleep, when we reflect on the day that's ending and the people we hold dear, stories like Naomi's remind us to cherish what we have and to never take for granted the safety and security that many of us are privileged to enjoy. They remind us that evil exists in the world, but so does justice, love, and the determination of good people to stand up for what's right. The case of Naomi Jones is closed in the legal sense. Her killer has been convicted and sentenced. But her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the community that refused to forget her. That, perhaps, is the most important part of her story, not how it ended, but how she is remembered, and how her life, though brief, continues to matter. As the night settles around us and we prepare for rest, we carry with us the stories of people like Naomi, not to disturb our sleep, but to remind us of our shared humanity and our responsibility to protect and care for one another. In remembering her, we honor not just her life, but the lives of all children who deserve to grow up safe, loved, and free from harm. The lights of Pensacola still shine on 8 Mile Creek, where Naomi was found, and on the Aspen Village apartments, where she lived her short but meaningful life. In that light, her memory endures, a 12-year-old girl who deserved so much more time, but whose story will never be forgotten by those who seek justice for the innocent and protection for the vulnerable. And in that remembrance, there is both sorrow and hope, sorrow for what was lost, and hope that by telling these stories, by refusing to look away from difficult truths, we can work together to create a world where children like Naomi can grow up safe and secure, surrounded by love and protected by communities that truly care about their well-being. The case of Naomi Jones reminds us that justice, while sometimes delayed, must never be denied. It reminds us that every child matters, every life has value, and every tragedy deserves our attention and our commitment to preventing similar occurrences in the future. As we close this story and prepare for rest, we do so with Naomi's memory in our hearts and a renewed commitment to the safety and protection of children everywhere. Her story may be one of tragedy, but it's also one of love, community, justice, and the enduring power of human compassion in the face of unthinkable loss. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to the quiet college town of Farmville, Virginia, where in September 2009, a brutal quadruple murder would shake this peaceful community to its core. This is the story of Richard Samuel McCroskey III, known in the underground music scene as Psycho Sam, and how an obsession with a dark subgenre of music became intertwined with one of Virginia's most shocking crimes. Let me take you back to a different time, when social media was still young, when MySpace was the dominant platform for connecting with others who shared your interests, no matter how niche or unusual they might be. It was in this digital landscape that our story begins, with a young man from California whose life would intersect with tragedy in ways no one could have predicted. In the suburbs of Castro Valley, California, 20-year-old Richard McCroskey lived what appeared to be an ordinary life on the surface. He worked at a local Goodwill store, lived with his parents, and seemed like any other young man trying to find his place in the world. But Richard had a passion that consumed much of his free time and energy. He was deeply immersed in the world of horrorcore rap. Horrorcore, for those unfamiliar with the genre, is a subgenre of hip-hop that focuses on horror-themed lyrics. The music often explores themes of death, violence, and the macabre, drawing inspiration from horror movies and darker aspects of human nature. Artists in this genre adopt personas that reflect these themes, creating elaborate fictional worlds filled with gore, supernatural elements, and graphic violence. Richard had embraced this world completely. Under the stage name Psycho Sam, he wrote and recorded his own horrorcore tracks, posting them online for the small but dedicated community of fans who appreciated this particular form of artistic expression. His songs had titles that reflected the genre's aesthetic, tracks with names that explored violent themes and dark imagery. But Richard wasn't content to simply create music in isolation. Like many young people, he sought connection and community. He found it on MySpace, where the horrorcore scene had carved out its own corner of the internet. Here, fans and artists alike gathered to share music, discuss their favorite performers, and connect with others who understood their appreciation for this dark art form. It was through these online interactions that Richard first encountered Emma Niederbrock, a 16-year-old girl from Virginia who shared his passion for horrorcore music. Emma was not just a passive fan, she was an active participant in the online community, engaging with artists and other fans, sharing music, and discussing the genre she loved. Emma lived in Farmville, Virginia, a small college town of about 8,000 residents. The town was home to Longwood University, and had the quiet, academic atmosphere typical of many college communities. Emma lived with her mother, Dr. Deborah Kelly, a professor at the university who had built a successful academic career. Emma's parents were divorced, but she maintained a relationship with her father, Mark Niederbrock, who worked as a Presbyterian minister in the area. Despite the geographical distance between California and Virginia, Richard and Emma developed what Richard came to view as a romantic relationship through their online interactions. They would spend hours chatting about music, sharing songs, and discussing their favorite artists. For Emma, this may have simply been a friendship with someone who shared her musical interests. For Richard, however, it became something much more significant. As their online relationship developed, Richard began to see Emma as his girlfriend. He spoke to friends and family about this girl in Virginia whom he cared deeply about. He made plans to visit her, talking excitedly about finally meeting in person. What Richard may not have fully understood was that Emma's feelings toward him were not as intense or romantic as his feelings toward her. This disconnect between Richard's perception of their relationship and the reality of Emma's feelings would prove to be a crucial element in the tragedy that was to come. But for now, in the summer of 2009, Richard was simply a young man excited about the prospect of meeting someone who shared his passion and whom he believed shared his romantic feelings. As summer turned to fall in 2009, Richard began making concrete plans to travel from California to Virginia. The trip was ostensibly planned around a horrorcore concert that was scheduled to take place in Michigan in mid-September. The concert would feature several prominent artists from the genre, and both Richard and Emma were excited about attending. For Richard, this concert represented the perfect opportunity to finally meet Emma in person. He made arrangements to travel to Virginia first, where he would spend time with Emma and her family before they would travel together to the concert in Michigan. Emma was enthusiastic about the concert and agreed to host Richard during his visit. Emma's mother, Dr. Deborah Kelly, was supportive of her daughter's interests, even if she didn't fully understand the appeal of horrorcore music. She agreed to allow Richard to stay in their home during his visit, seeing it as an opportunity for Emma to spend time with a friend who shared her musical passion. Dr. Kelly was an accomplished woman. She held a doctorate and taught at Longwood University, where she was respected by both colleagues and students. Emma had also invited her close friend, Melanie Wells, to join them for the trip to the concert. Melanie was 18 years old and, like Emma, was a fan of horrorcore music. The three young people, Richard, Emma, and Melanie, were looking forward to what they expected to be an exciting adventure to see some of their favorite artists perform live. As the date of Richard's visit approached, he made the long journey from California to Virginia, traveling by plane with expectations of a wonderful time with Emma and the anticipation of attending the concert they had discussed for weeks. He arrived in Farmville carrying his belongings and what he believed were the hopes of deepening his relationship with Emma. The Kelly home in Farmville was a comfortable, middle-class residence that reflected Dr. Kelly's academic success and her dedication to providing a good life for her daughter. It was the type of home you might expect to find in any college town, well-maintained, welcoming, and filled with the evidence of a family's life together. When Richard arrived, he was welcomed into the home and introduced to the rhythms of the Kelly household. Dr. Kelly treated him as she would any of Emma's friends, with courtesy and hospitality. Emma was excited to finally meet her online friend in person, looking forward to sharing her love of music with someone who truly understood it. For the first few days of Richard's visit, things seemed to go smoothly. The group prepared for their trip to Michigan, made plans for the concert, and spent time together listening to music and talking about the artists they would soon see perform. There was an air of anticipation and excitement as they looked forward to their adventure. On September 14, 2009, Richard, Emma, and Melanie traveled to Michigan for the horrorcore concert they had all been eagerly anticipating. The drive from Virginia to Michigan gave them plenty of time to talk about music, discuss the artists they were going to see, and bond over their shared enthusiasm for the genre. The concert itself was everything they had hoped it would be. They saw several of their favorite horrorcore artists perform live, experiencing the energy and community of fellow fans who shared their passion. For a few hours, they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to a community of people who appreciated this particular form of artistic expression. But as the evening progressed and the concert came to an end, the group began the long drive back to Virginia. It was during this return journey that the first signs of trouble began to emerge. Richard had been expecting this trip to solidify his relationship with Emma, to transform their online connection into something deeper and more romantic. However, Emma's behavior during the trip may not have matched these expectations. Perhaps Emma had begun to realize that Richard's feelings for her were more intense than her feelings for him. Perhaps she had started to feel uncomfortable with the romantic expectations he seemed to have. Or perhaps, as often happens when online relationships transition to real-world meetings, the chemistry that had seemed to exist in their digital interaction simply didn't translate to their in-person connection. Whatever the specific dynamics, it became clear during the trip that Richard's hopes for the relationship were not going to be fulfilled. Emma may have attempted to clarify the nature of their relationship, explaining that she saw him as a friend rather than a romantic partner. For someone who had invested so much emotional energy into the relationship he believed they shared, this would have been a devastating blow. The group returned to Farmville on the evening of September 14, tired from the long drive and the excitement of the concert. They arrived at the Kelly home, where Dr. Deborah Kelly was waiting for them. She was interested to hear about their experience at the concert and glad to see them return safely from their trip. As the evening wound down, the household began to settle in for the night. Emma and Melanie were tired from the long day and the drive, and they prepared for bed. Dr. Kelly, who had work the next day, also retired for the evening. The house grew quiet as its occupants settled into sleep, believing they were safe in their own home. But Richard was not settling into peaceful sleep. The disappointment and rejection he felt about his relationship with Emma had been building throughout the trip, and as the house grew quiet around him, these feelings began to transform into something much darker. In the early morning hours of September 15, 2009, as the Kelly household slept peacefully, Richard McCroskey moved through the quiet house with deadly intent. He had found a ball-peen hammer, a common household tool that would become the instrument of an unthinkable tragedy. His first victim was Melanie Wells, Emma's 18-year-old friend who had joined them on their trip to the concert. She was sleeping on a couch in the den when Richard attacked her, using the hammer to bludgeon her to death as she slept. Melanie never had a chance to defend herself or even understand what was happening. Next was Kelly, also asleep in her upstairs office. Dr. Deborah Kelly, the accomplished professor who had welcomed Richard into her home with kindness and hospitality, became his second victim. Like Melanie, she was attacked while she slept, unable to comprehend or defend against the sudden violence that had invaded her peaceful home. McCroskey killed Emma while she slept in her bedroom. The young woman who had shared his passion for music, who had connected with him across the digital divide, who had welcomed him into her life and her home, became his final victim in this initial wave of violence. The relationship that had begun with shared musical interests and online conversations ended in the most brutal way imaginable. The house that had been filled with excitement about the concert just hours before was now a scene of unimaginable horror. 3 people were dead, their lives cut short by an act of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. But Richard's night of killing was not yet complete. After committing these murders, Richard remained in the house with the bodies of his victims. He made no attempt to flee immediately, instead staying in the home where he had just committed these unspeakable acts. Perhaps he was in shock at what he had done. Perhaps he was trying to process the magnitude of his actions. Or perhaps he was simply waiting. When Mark Niederbrock went to Kelly's home the next day, he had no idea what horror awaited him inside. Mark, Emma's father and Dr. Kelly's ex-husband, was a Presbyterian minister who had come to check on his daughter and her house guest. Perhaps he had planned to hear about the concert, or maybe he simply wanted to spend some time with Emma. When Mark arrived at the house and entered, he discovered the scene of carnage that Richard had created. But before he could fully comprehend what had happened or take any action, Mark Niederbrock was killed with the tool when he came to check on them, becoming the 4th and final victim of Richard's rampage. The quiet college town house that had welcomed a young man interested in music had become the site of a quadruple murder. 4 people, 3 women and 1 man, ranging in age from 16 to 53, had lost their lives to violence that seemed to come out of nowhere. Richard had now killed 4 people, but still he did not flee. Instead, he remained in the house with the bodies of his victims for several more days. What went through his mind during this time is difficult to imagine. He was living in a house with 4 decomposing bodies, surrounded by the evidence of his violent acts. As days passed without contact from the residents of the Kelly home, friends and neighbors began to grow concerned. Emma was a social young woman, and her absence from her usual activities was noted. Dr. Kelly was a responsible professor, and her failure to appear for work raised alarm among her colleagues. They were thinking animal. A dog, a cat, something like that. They never imagined they were smelling the remains of massacred humans. It was Thursday, September 17th. Neighbors had begun to notice an unpleasant smell coming from the area of the Kelly home, but they assumed it was something ordinary, perhaps a dead animal. But another 24 hours would pass before police made the gruesome discovery. It wasn't until September 18th that authorities finally entered the home and discovered the scene of horror that awaited them inside. The bodies were found just after 3 p.m. on September 18, 2009, 3 days after the murders had taken place. 4 people found slain in a small Virginia college town were bludgeoned to death, all victims of the same brutal attack. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community of Farmville. This was not the type of crime that residents of this quiet college town expected to encounter. The brutality of the murders and the fact that they had occurred in what seemed to be a safe, ordinary neighborhood left the community reeling. Police immediately began searching for Richard McCroskey, who was nowhere to be found at the scene. They quickly identified him as the primary suspect, given that he had been staying in the home and was now missing. A manhunt began as authorities worked to locate the young man from California who had somehow transformed from a house guest into a quadruple killer. Richard had finally left the house after spending days with the bodies of his victims, but he hadn't gone far. When police located him, he was not attempting to flee the state or evade capture in any sophisticated way. Instead, he was found at the Richmond International Airport, apparently attempting to catch a flight back to California. His arrest was swift and without incident. Richard offered no resistance when police apprehended him, and he was quickly taken into custody. The young man who had traveled from California with hopes of romance and musical adventure was now facing charges for 4 brutal murders. McCroskey, who had no prior criminal record, was first charged with first-degree murder, robbery and grand larceny, stealing the car, but later was charged with 6 counts of capital murder. The charges reflected the severity of his crimes and the multiple victims involved. McCroskey was subsequently held in Piedmont Regional Jail, on suicide watch. Authorities were concerned about his mental state and took precautions to ensure he could not harm himself while in custody. The arrest brought some sense of relief to the community, knowing that the person responsible for these horrific crimes was in custody and could no longer pose a threat. But it also raised numerous questions about how and why such a brutal crime had occurred in their peaceful town. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they worked to understand what had motivated Richard to commit such brutal acts against people who had welcomed him into their home. The connection to horrorcore music inevitably became part of the discussion, as people struggled to understand how someone with no criminal history could suddenly commit such violent acts. The killer also provided a motive for the murders, explaining that Emma was his target because she had made him feel rejected, and he chose to kill the others to leave no witnesses. This revelation provided some insight into Richard's mindset, suggesting that the murders stemmed from his inability to handle romantic rejection. The investigation revealed the disturbing reality that this quadruple murder had its roots in a misunderstanding about the nature of an online relationship. Richard's perception of his connection with Emma had been far more romantic and intense than the reality of their friendship. When confronted with the truth that Emma did not share his romantic feelings, he had responded with devastating violence. Richard McCroskey was recorded multiple times by the media appearing to smile and laugh. This disturbing behavior in the aftermath of such serious charges troubled many observers and raised questions about his mental state and his understanding of the gravity of his actions. The case also sparked broader discussions about the influence of violent media on young people. In the wake of this horrific act, the media was quick to question whether Richard's obsession with horrorcore rap was to blame for his crimes. This debate would continue throughout the legal proceedings, with various experts and commentators weighing in on whether the violent themes in horrorcore music could have contributed to Richard's actions. The legal case against Richard McCroskey moved forward through the Virginia court system, with prosecutors seeking to hold him accountable for the 4 lives he had taken. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been present at the scene, he was found with the victim's car, and his own statements to police provided details about the crimes. McCroskey's attorneys told the court that the murders happened after their client, with Emma Niederbrock and her friend Melanie Wells, attended a horrorcore concert September 14. The defense team worked to provide context for the crimes while preparing to negotiate a resolution to the case. Ultimately, Richard chose not to fight the charges against him. Psycho Sam McCroskey, who aspired to being a horrorcore rapper, pleaded guilty Monday to killing 4 people in Central Virginia and was sentenced to life in prison. By pleading guilty, he avoided the possibility of a death sentence and accepted responsibility for his actions. Richard McCroskey was sentenced to life in prison in Virginia, USA, for killing 4 people in Farmville on September 15, 2009. This sentence ensured that he would never again be free to harm others, providing some measure of justice for the families of his victims and the community that had been traumatized by his actions. As the legal proceedings concluded and Richard McCroskey began his life sentence, the community of Farmville and the families of the victims worked to remember and honor the 4 people whose lives had been cut short by this senseless violence. Emma Niederbrock had been just 16 years old, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had been passionate about music and had formed connections with people who shared her interests. Her life was ended just as she was beginning to discover who she wanted to become. Melanie Wells, at 18, had been Emma's close friend and companion on what should have been a fun trip to see their favorite artists perform. Instead, that trip became the last experience of her young life. She had trusted Richard as Emma's friend and had welcomed him into their group, never suspecting the danger he posed. Dr. Deborah Kelly had been a successful academic and devoted mother who had worked hard to build a good life for herself and her daughter. She had opened her home to her daughter's friend, extending hospitality and kindness to someone she barely knew. Her generosity and trust had been repaid with violence. Mark Niederbrock had been a minister, someone who had dedicated his life to serving others and providing spiritual guidance to his community. He had come to check on his daughter and had walked unknowingly into a scene of horror, becoming the final victim of Richard's rampage. Each of these 4 people had their own dreams, relationships, and contributions to make to the world. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but a loss to their community and to all the people whose lives they had touched. The case of the horrorcore killer had implications that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. It raised questions about online relationships and the potential dangers of meeting people from the internet, particularly for young people who might not fully understand the risks involved. The case also sparked ongoing debates about the influence of violent media on behavior. While many horrorcore artists and fans argued that the music was simply artistic expression and that millions of people consumed violent media without committing violent acts, others pointed to cases like Richard's as evidence of potential harmful effects. Mental health professionals used the case to discuss the importance of recognizing warning signs of dangerous behavior and the need for better resources for people struggling with rejection, depression, or other psychological issues that might lead to violence. For the horrorcore community itself, the case was troubling because it seemed to validate critics who argued that the genre promoted or encouraged violence. Many artists and fans worked to distance themselves from Richard's actions while defending their right to create and enjoy artistic expressions that explored dark themes. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of young people in online spaces, where they might develop relationships with people they don't truly know and whose intentions they cannot fully assess. Emma's tragic death served as a stark reminder of the potential dangers lurking behind friendly online personas. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to reflect on the multiple layers of loss and sorrow that emerged from Richard McCroskey's actions. For innocent people lost their lives because one young man could not handle the reality that his romantic feelings were not reciprocated. The case demonstrates how quickly a situation can escalate from disappointment to violence when someone lacks the emotional tools to cope with rejection or unmet expectations. Richard's inability to process Emma's lack of romantic interest in a healthy way led to a chain of events that destroyed multiple lives and devastated a community. It also shows how online relationships, while capable of creating genuine connections between people, can sometimes be built on misunderstandings or false assumptions about the other person's feelings or intentions. The digital medium can make it easy to project our own hopes and desires onto others without truly understanding their perspective. The tragedy in Farmville reminds us of the importance of mental health resources and the need for people to seek help when they are struggling with difficult emotions like rejection, anger, or depression. While most people who experience romantic disappointment do not turn to violence, those who do often show warning signs that, if recognized and addressed, might prevent tragedy. For the families of the victims, the community of Farmville, and everyone touched by this case, the healing process has been long and difficult. The sudden, violent loss of 4 beloved community members left scars that may never fully heal, but also demonstrated the resilience and strength of people coming together in the face of unthinkable tragedy. The story of Richard McCroskey serves as both a true crime narrative and a cautionary tale about the potential consequences when mental health issues, misunderstood relationships, and poor coping mechanisms intersect in dangerous ways. It reminds us to pay attention to the people around us, to seek help when we need it, and to remember that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives were cut tragically short. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps this story will serve as a reminder of the importance of kindness, understanding, and seeking healthy ways to handle life's disappointments and rejections. The 4 victims in Farmville deserved so much more than the fate that befell them, and their memory deserves to be honored by learning from this tragedy and working to prevent others like it. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Tonight, we delve into one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases in recent true crime history, a story that challenges everything we think we know about family bonds, childhood innocence, and the nature of evil itself. This is the story of 4-year-old Ella Bennett, a bright little girl with her whole life ahead of her, and the unthinkable betrayal that ended her life on a cold February evening in 2007. What makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of the crime, but the calculated nature of it, and the shocking identity of the perpetrator. Sometimes the most dangerous person in our lives is the one we trust most completely. Our story begins in Abilene, Texas, a quiet city in the heart of the Lone Star State. Here lived Charity Bennett, a young single mother trying her best to raise 2 children while working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Like many single parents, Charity's life was a constant balancing act between providing for her family and being present for her kids. Charity had 2 children who meant everything to her. Her eldest was Paris Lee Bennett, born in 1993, a boy who seemed exceptionally bright from an early age. Paris was the kind of child who impressed adults with his intelligence and articulate speech. Teachers often commented on his advanced vocabulary and his ability to grasp complex concepts that were well beyond his years. Then there was Ella Lee Bennett, born on April 12, 2002, in Newnan, Georgia. Ella was Charity's baby, a sweet, innocent 4-year-old with the kind of infectious smile that could light up any room. She was the typical youngest child, bubbly, curious, and adored by everyone who met her. The age gap between the siblings was significant. Paris was 9 years older than Ella, but to outsiders, they seemed like a normal family unit. Charity worked hard to provide for her children. She had taken a job at Buffalo Wild Wings, a popular sports bar and restaurant chain, where she worked long hours, especially during busy periods like major sporting events. The pay wasn't much, but she was determined to create a stable life for Paris and Ella after some difficult periods in their past. Like many families, the Bennetts had faced their share of struggles. Charity had battled with substance abuse in the past, something that had created instability in the household. However, she had been working hard to turn her life around for her children. She was in recovery and trying to build a better future for her family. What Charity didn't fully understand at the time was that beneath Paris's impressive intelligence and charming exterior, something much darker was brewing. Paris wasn't just a bright child, he was exhibiting signs that would later be recognized as deeply troubling. From a young age, Paris had displayed concerning behaviors that went far beyond typical childhood acting out. According to later testimonies and psychological evaluations, Paris had been experiencing what he would later describe as homicidal thoughts since he was very young. These weren't fleeting moments of anger or typical sibling rivalry, they were persistent, calculated thoughts about harming others. Even more disturbing was Paris's apparent understanding of how to manipulate the adults around him. His high intelligence became a tool for deception rather than achievement. He learned early how to present himself as the perfect child when needed, while harboring much darker intentions beneath the surface. Charity would later reveal that she first became aware of Paris's potential for harm when he was only 8 years old. There had been incidents, warning signs that something wasn't quite right with her eldest child. However, like many parents in similar situations, she struggled to reconcile the charming, intelligent boy she saw most of the time with these occasional glimpses of something much more sinister. Paris's relationship with his mother was complex and troubled. Despite her efforts to be a good parent, he seemed to harbor a deep resentment toward Charity. In his mind, she was responsible for the instability in their lives, for the times when her addiction had taken precedence over their family. This resentment would fester and grow, eventually becoming the driving force behind an unthinkable act of revenge. February 4, 2007, started like any other Sunday for the Bennett family, but it would end in unimaginable tragedy. It was Super Bowl Sunday, which meant Charity would be working a long shift at Buffalo Wild Wings. The restaurant would be packed with customers watching the big game between the Indianapolis Colts and the Chicago Bears, and every server would be needed to handle the crowds. Knowing she would be away from home for most of the evening, Charity made arrangements for childcare. She hired a babysitter to watch Paris and Ella while she worked. This was a routine she had followed many times before, responsible childcare arrangements that would ensure her children were safe and supervised while she earned the money needed to support their family. The babysitter arrived as planned, and Charity left for work, probably giving her children the usual hugs and kisses goodbye, telling them to be good and that she'd see them when she got home. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would see Ella alive. For most of the evening, everything appeared normal. The babysitter was there supervising the children, Paris was being his usual well-behaved self, and little Ella was playing and enjoying her Sunday evening. But around 10 p.m., something changed. Paris, with his characteristic ability to manipulate adults, somehow convinced the babysitter to leave early. The exact details of how he accomplished this aren't entirely clear, but given his history of manipulation and his intelligence, it's likely he presented a convincing reason why her services were no longer needed that evening. Perhaps he told her that his mother had called and said she was coming home early, or that plans had changed in some way. Whatever story he told, it worked. The babysitter gathered her things and left the house, leaving 13-year-old Paris alone with 4-year-old Ella. In most circumstances, this wouldn't be considered unreasonable. 13 is old enough to babysit a younger sibling for a short period. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Paris wasn't a normal 13-year-old. With the babysitter gone and the house quiet, Paris had the opportunity he had been waiting for. What happened next reveals the calculated, cold-blooded nature of his plan. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage or a childhood accident gone wrong. This was a deliberate, premeditated act designed to cause maximum emotional damage to his mother. Paris had been planning this for some time. His resentment toward Charity had been building, and he had determined that the best way to hurt her, to truly destroy her, was to take away what she loved most. Initially, he had considered killing Charity directly, but he realized that killing Ella would be even more devastating. As he would later explain with chilling clarity, losing a child would cause Charity far more pain than losing her own life, and it would be a pain that would last forever. Sometime before 11:30 p.m., Paris entered Ella's room where the 4-year-old was likely sleeping peacefully, completely trusting in her big brother's presence. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension. Paris attacked his little sister, choking her and sexually assaulting her before stabbing her 17 times with a knife he had taken from the kitchen. Ella, just 4 years old, small and completely defenseless, had no way to protect herself from this attack. She trusted Paris completely. He was her big brother, someone who was supposed to protect her, not harm her. The betrayal was as devastating as the physical violence. The attack was vicious and prolonged. 17 stab wounds speak to a level of violence that goes far beyond what would be necessary to kill a small child. This was an attack driven by rage, but it was also calculated and deliberate. Paris knew exactly what he was doing, and he continued his assault until Ella was dead. After killing Ella, Paris didn't immediately call for help. Instead, he made a phone call to a school friend, a conversation that lasted approximately 6 minutes. The content of this call remains private, but its timing is significant. Rather than immediately seeking help for his sister or panicking about what he had done, Paris took the time to have a casual conversation with a friend. This suggests a level of emotional detachment that is truly chilling. It wasn't until 11:42 p.m. that Paris finally dialed 911. The call he made to emergency services would become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case, not just for what it revealed about the crime, but for what it showed about Paris's state of mind. When the dispatcher answered, Paris didn't present himself as a panicked child who had witnessed a terrible accident. Instead, he attempted to portray himself as mentally unstable, possibly hoping to lay the groundwork for an insanity defense. He told the dispatcher that he thought Ella was an inflamed pumpkin-headed demon and that he had stabbed her because of this delusion. This performance was clearly calculated. Paris was trying to present himself as someone who was not in control of his actions, someone who was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for what had happened. However, the very fact that he was able to construct this narrative so quickly after committing murder suggests that he was thinking clearly and strategically. When the dispatcher instructed Paris to perform CPR on Ella in an attempt to save her life, Paris pretended to comply. He counted along with the dispatcher's instructions while pacing around the room, making it sound as though he was following the life-saving procedures. In reality, he was doing nothing to help his sister, even allowing the dispatcher to believe that there might still be hope for Ella's survival. This behavior during the 911 call is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Even after committing this horrific act, Paris continued to manipulate and deceive, showing no genuine remorse or concern for Ella's life. When police and emergency responders arrived at the Bennett home shortly before 12:30 a.m., they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Little Ella was found in her room, the victim of a brutal and senseless attack. The physical evidence made it immediately clear that this was not an accident or the result of an intruder, this was a deliberate and vicious murder. Paris was arrested at the scene. Despite his attempts to portray himself as mentally unstable, the responding officers noted his calm demeanor and his ability to communicate clearly about what had happened. This was not the behavior of someone in the midst of a psychotic break, but rather someone who was very much in control of his faculties. The investigation that followed would reveal the calculated nature of Paris's crime. There was no evidence of an intruder, no signs of a struggle that would suggest Ella had fought back against an unknown attacker. The evidence pointed clearly to Paris as the perpetrator, and his own statements to the 911 dispatcher had essentially provided a confession. As news of the murder spread through the community, shock and disbelief were the predominant reactions. Neighbors and acquaintances of the Bennett family struggled to understand how something so horrific could happen in their quiet neighborhood. The idea that a 13-year-old could commit such a brutal crime against his own sister was almost incomprehensible. When Charity received the call that would change her life forever, she was still at work at Buffalo Wild Wings, serving customers and probably looking forward to going home to her children. The call came from police, informing her that there had been an incident at her home and that she needed to come immediately. Nothing could have prepared Charity for what she learned when she arrived. Her baby, her 4-year-old daughter Ella, was dead. And the person responsible was her own son, Paris, the boy she had raised and loved for 13 years. The psychological impact of this revelation is difficult to comprehend. In a single moment, Charity had lost both of her children, one to death and one to the criminal justice system. The son she thought she knew, the intelligent and articulate boy who had seemed like her partner in raising Ella, had been living a secret life filled with violence and hatred. Initially, Charity maintained contact with Paris after his arrest. This decision might seem incomprehensible to outsiders, but it reflects the complex emotions that parents experience when their child commits a serious crime. Despite what he had done, Paris was still her son, and part of her struggled to reconcile the boy she had raised with the monster who had killed Ella. Paris himself was apparently surprised by his mother's continued contact with him after the murder. This suggests that he had expected her to completely reject him, which may have been part of his plan. The fact that she continued to love him despite his actions may have been something he hadn't anticipated. However, Charity's relationship with Paris would become increasingly complicated as she learned more about his true nature and his motivations for the crime. Paris Bennett was charged with capital murder in the death of his sister Ella. However, due to his age at the time of the crime, he could not be tried as an adult under Texas law. The minimum age for adult prosecution for capital murder in Texas is 14, and Paris was only 13 when he killed Ella. This meant that Paris would be tried in juvenile court, where the maximum possible sentence was significantly less than what he would have faced in adult court. The maximum sentence for capital murder in juvenile court in Texas is 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Paris ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges against him. This plea eliminated the need for a trial, sparing his family and the community from having to relive the details of Ella's murder in a public courtroom. However, it also meant that many of the specific details about his motivations and mental state would not be explored in the same depth as they might have been during a full trial. The judge sentenced Paris to the maximum penalty available under juvenile law, 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 20 years. While this was the harshest sentence possible given the circumstances, many felt that it was insufficient for such a horrific crime. During the legal proceedings, Paris underwent extensive psychological evaluation. The results of these evaluations were deeply disturbing. Paris was diagnosed as a psychopath, a clinical condition characterized by a lack of empathy, remorse, and emotional connection to others. Perhaps even more chilling was Paris's own admission that he had been experiencing homicidal thoughts since early childhood. This wasn't a case of a normal child who had suddenly snapped under pressure. This was someone who had been harboring violent fantasies for years and had finally acted on them. When Paris was 19 years old, he was transferred from juvenile detention to adult prison, where he would serve the remainder of his sentence. This transition marked a new phase in his incarceration and provided more insight into his character and mental state. Life in adult prison presented new challenges and opportunities for Paris. His intelligence and manipulative abilities, which had served him well in juvenile detention, would be tested against more experienced and dangerous inmates. However, reports suggest that he has generally adapted well to prison life, which is not surprising given his lack of emotional attachment to the outside world. Throughout his incarceration, Paris has continued to demonstrate the same cold, calculating personality that led him to murder his sister. He has shown little genuine remorse for his actions and has continued to view the crime primarily in terms of how successfully it accomplished his goal of hurting his mother. In interviews and communications from prison, Paris has displayed an unsettling pride in his crime. He sees himself as having successfully executed a complex plan, and he appears to take satisfaction in the lasting pain he has caused his mother. This attitude has remained consistent throughout his imprisonment. Charity's journey following Ella's murder has been one of unimaginable grief, complicated by her relationship with her surviving child. For years after the murder, she maintained contact with Paris, visiting him in prison and accepting his phone calls. This decision was criticized by some, but it reflects the complex emotions that parents experience when their child commits a serious crime. However, Charity's relationship with Paris would eventually reach a breaking point. As she learned more about his true nature and his lack of genuine remorse, she began to understand that the son she thought she knew had never really existed. The boy she had raised and loved was, in many ways, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide his true, violent nature. The final straw came in 2021, when Charity learned that Paris had become involved with a woman who was facing charges related to planning a mass shooting. This revelation forced Charity to confront the reality that Paris remained dangerous and that his violent tendencies had not been reformed by his time in prison. In a statement that reflected her emotional journey, Charity said, "I finally accepted it is okay to love him as my son but really dislike the man he has become." This statement encapsulates the impossible position she found herself in, loving the memory of the child she thought she had raised while accepting the reality of who he had become. Charity has also had to face the reality that she and any future children might be in danger when Paris is eventually released from prison. Experts have warned her that Paris continues to view her as the target of his rage and that his release could put her at risk. She has accepted that she will likely need to relocate and take other security measures when that time comes. The murder of Ella Bennett sent shockwaves through the Abilene community and beyond. The case challenged many people's assumptions about childhood, family bonds, and the nature of evil. The idea that a 13-year-old could commit such a calculated and brutal crime against his own sister was almost incomprehensible to many. The case also raised difficult questions about warning signs and prevention. In retrospect, there had been indicators that Paris was troubled and potentially dangerous, but these signs had not been sufficient to predict or prevent the tragedy that occurred. This has led to increased awareness about childhood psychopathy and the importance of early intervention when concerning behaviors are identified. Mental health professionals have used Paris's case as an example of childhood psychopathy, a rare but dangerous condition that can manifest in extreme violence. The case has contributed to research and understanding of how to identify and manage children who display these concerning traits. Mental health experts who have studied Paris's case have reached some disturbing conclusions about his potential for rehabilitation. The consensus among professionals is that Paris represents a rare but genuine example of a child psychopath, someone whose lack of empathy and propensity for violence are likely to be permanent characteristics. Dr. Helen Morrison and other experts in the field have stated that it is unlikely that Paris could ever be truly rehabilitated. His lack of genuine remorse, his continued pride in his crime, and his persistent view of others as objects to be manipulated rather than people worthy of empathy all suggest that he poses an ongoing danger to society. This professional assessment has important implications for Paris's eventual parole hearings. While he will become eligible for parole in February 2027, after serving 20 years of his sentence, the expert opinions about his likelihood of reoffending will undoubtedly factor into any decision about his release. The case of Paris and Ella Bennett has been the subject of extensive media coverage, including a documentary titled "The Family I Had," that provides an in-depth look at the crime and its aftermath. This documentary features interviews with Charity and provides insight into the family's experience both before and after the murder. The documentary is particularly valuable because it allows viewers to see the human impact of the crime beyond the basic facts of the case. Charity's interviews reveal the ongoing struggle of a mother trying to cope with the loss of one child and the knowledge that her other child is responsible for that loss. The media coverage of the case has also highlighted the broader issues surrounding childhood psychopathy and juvenile crime. The case has become a reference point for discussions about how the justice system should handle young offenders who commit serious violent crimes. As of 2025, Paris Bennett remains incarcerated at the Ferguson unit in Texas, where he is serving his 40-year sentence. He will first become eligible for parole in February 2027, when he will have served 20 years for his crime. If he is never granted parole, he will be released automatically in February 2047, when his full sentence is completed. The prospect of Paris's eventual release continues to cause concern among those familiar with the case. His lack of genuine remorse, his continued dangerous mindset, and the expert opinions about his likelihood of reoffending all suggest that he may pose a significant risk to public safety upon release. Charity has acknowledged that she will need to take precautions to protect herself and any future family members when Paris is released. She has been advised that he continues to view her as the primary target of his rage and that his release could put her in danger. The parole hearings, when they occur, will likely be highly controversial. On one hand, Paris will have served the minimum sentence required by law and may present himself as reformed and ready for reintegration into society. On the other hand, the expert assessments and his behavior during incarceration suggest that he remains dangerous and unrepentant. The murder of Ella Bennett by her brother Paris is a case that challenges many of our assumptions about family, childhood, and the nature of evil. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most dangerous person in our lives can be someone we trust completely. The case also highlights the importance of taking warning signs seriously when they appear in children. While most children who display concerning behaviors will never commit violent crimes, the case of Paris Bennett shows that some children are capable of extreme violence and that early intervention is crucial. Perhaps most importantly, this case reminds us of the lasting impact that violent crime has on families and communities. Charity Bennett's journey from loving mother to grieving survivor illustrates the ripple effects of violence and the complex emotions that families experience when dealing with both victimization and offending within the same family unit. The story of Ella Bennett is ultimately a tragedy in the truest sense, the senseless loss of an innocent life at the hands of someone who should have protected her. As we reflect on this case, we remember Ella not as a victim of violence, but as a bright, loving 4-year-old whose life was cut tragically short. Her memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. While we may never fully understand what drives someone to commit such a horrific act against their own family, we can honor Ella's memory by continuing to seek justice, understanding, and prevention in cases like these. The case of Paris and Ella Bennett remains one of the most disturbing examples of juvenile crime in recent history. It is a story that defies easy explanation and challenges our understanding of human nature, family bonds, and the capacity for evil that can exist even in children. As Paris Bennett continues to serve his sentence and approaches his first parole hearing, the questions raised by this case remain as relevant as ever. How do we identify and intervene with children who display dangerous behaviors? How do we balance the possibility of rehabilitation with the need to protect public safety? And how do we support families who find themselves torn apart by violence from within? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask and explore if we hope to prevent future tragedies like the one that befell 4-year-old Ella Bennett on that February night in 2007. Tonight, as we close this story, we remember Ella Lee Bennett, not as the victim of a senseless crime, but as a beloved daughter and sister whose short life brought joy to those who knew her. Her memory reminds us of the importance of protecting the innocent and seeking justice for those who cannot seek it for themselves. In the quiet moments before sleep, we might reflect on the complexity of human nature, the preciousness of family bonds, and the ongoing quest for understanding in a world where such incomprehensible acts of violence can occur. May Ella's story serve as both a warning and a reminder of our responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey to the neon-lit streets of Tokyo in the year 2000, where dreams collided with darkness in one of Japan's most haunting criminal cases. This is the story of Lucy Blackman, a young British woman whose disappearance would expose the dangerous underbelly of Tokyo's nightlife and lead to an investigation that would span continents and capture international attention. Picture this, May 2000. Lucy Blackman, a 21-year-old from Sevenoaks in Kent, was working as an airline stewardess for British Airways when she made a decision that would change everything. Along with her friend Louise Phillips, she decided to leave behind the familiar grey skies of England for the electric promise of Tokyo. Lucy was everything you'd expect from a young woman ready to take on the world. Blonde, vivacious, and eager for new experiences, she embodied the spirit of adventure that drives so many young people to seek their fortunes in foreign lands. The two friends arrived in Tokyo on a 90-day visa in May, ready to swap their flight attendant uniforms for something entirely different. Tokyo in 2000 was a city of contrasts. By day, it hummed with the energy of one of the world's most advanced metropolises. Gleaming skyscrapers stretched toward the sky, bullet trains whisked passengers across the country at impossible speeds, and technology seemed to leap forward with each passing month. But as the sun set, Tokyo revealed another face entirely, particularly in districts like Roppongi, where the nightlife catered to both locals and the growing population of foreign expatriates. It was in this twilight world that Lucy and Louise found their new calling. The pair got jobs as hostesses at the Casablanca bar in Roppongi, Tokyo. To understand what happened to Lucy, we need to understand the world she entered, a world that would have seemed both exciting and exotic to a young British woman looking for adventure. The hostess bar culture in Japan is complex and often misunderstood by outsiders. These establishments aren't what many Westerners might assume. Hostesses are paid to drink and socialize, but not sleep with, free-spending clientele. The role of a hostess is part entertainer, part companion, part therapist. They listen to the troubles of businessmen, laugh at their jokes, and provide the illusion of feminine attention and affection. For young foreign women like Lucy, these jobs offered something that traditional employment couldn't: substantial money for relatively few hours of work. The pay was particularly attractive for someone looking to fund an extended stay in one of the world's most expensive cities. But beneath the surface glamour lay a more complex and sometimes dangerous reality. The relationship between hostess and client was meant to remain within the confines of the club, but there was an exception that would prove fatal. If a woman accepted a dohan, a paid dinner date with one of the club's patrons outside the premises, she could very well find herself in deep danger. July 1, 2000. It was a Saturday, and Lucy Blackman was last seen leaving the Casablanca Club. The day had started like many others in her new Tokyo life. She had been working at the hostess bar for about a month, long enough to understand the rhythms of the job but perhaps not long enough to fully grasp all its potential dangers. That evening, Lucy had agreed to go on a dohan with a client. It wasn't unusual. These paid dates outside the club were a normal part of the hostess world, offering additional income for what should have been a simple dinner or social outing. The client was a man who would later be identified as someone who had specifically requested her company. Louise Phillips, her friend and roommate, expected Lucy to return that night as she always did. When Lucy didn't come home, Louise initially wasn't alarmed. Perhaps the evening had run late, or perhaps Lucy had decided to stay out longer than planned. But as hours turned into days, concern grew into panic. Less than a month after her move to Tokyo, Lucy had simply vanished. When someone disappears in a foreign country, the complexities multiply exponentially. Language barriers, different legal systems, and cultural misunderstandings can all impede what should be a straightforward investigation. For Lucy's family back in England, the distance felt insurmountable. Lucy's father, Tim, arrived in Tokyo quickly, and grew impatient with the police investigation just as fast. A beefy man who seemed preternaturally poised, Tim Blackman knew how to play the media, in Japan and in London, and he deftly inserted himself into the story as a means of speeding up what he saw as a slow-moving Tokyo police response to his daughter's disappearance. Tim Blackman's frustration was understandable. The documentary claims that the police's initial apathy towards Lucy's disappearance is because, sadly, young women went missing in Tokyo all too often, although usually for benign reasons. To the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, this might have seemed like another case of a young foreign woman who had simply decided to move on or return home without telling anyone. But Tim Blackman refused to accept this explanation. He understood that in cases like these, media attention could be the difference between a case that faded away and one that received the resources it deserved. Securing UK Prime Minister Tony Blair's involvement in the investigation was largely the work of Lucy's father Tim, who worked tirelessly to achieve widespread international media coverage in a bid to convince the Japanese police to take her case more seriously. The involvement of the British Prime Minister in what was initially treated as a missing person case was extraordinary, but it demonstrated the power of persistent advocacy and media pressure. The case was no longer just about one missing young woman, it had become a matter of international relations. As the investigation intensified, a clearer picture began to emerge of Lucy's final known movements. She had indeed left with a client for what was supposed to be a dohan, but the details of that evening remained frustratingly elusive. The client who had taken her out became the focus of the investigation, but identifying him proved more challenging than anyone anticipated. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police, now under intense international scrutiny, began to dig deeper into the shadowy world of Roppongi's nightlife. What they discovered was a network of establishments that catered to wealthy clients, some of whom had particular and disturbing preferences. Months passed with little concrete progress. The investigation seemed to hit one dead end after another, and the media attention that had initially helped propel the case forward began to wane. For families of missing persons, this is often the most difficult phase, when the initial burst of activity and hope gives way to the grinding uncertainty of a case that seems to have stalled. But investigations often move in ways that aren't immediately visible to the public. Behind the scenes, detectives were building a comprehensive picture of the Tokyo hostess bar scene and the men who frequented it. They were learning about the culture, the money, and most importantly, the people who moved through this world with concerning patterns of behavior. On February 9, 2001, Assistant Inspector Yuji Nozo of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police found Blackman's body, 223 days after she went missing, in a small cave on the beach in Aburotsubo. The discovery was both a relief and a horror for everyone who had been following the case. Lucy had been cut into 8 pieces and her head was encased in concrete. The methodical nature of what had been done to her body spoke of a perpetrator who was not only capable of murder but who had approached the disposal of evidence with calculated precision. The location of the discovery was significant. The cave was just a few yards away from a property that would soon become central to the investigation. This wasn't a random location chosen to hide evidence, it suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the area, someone who felt safe and comfortable in this particular stretch of coastline. The forensic examination of Lucy's remains would provide crucial evidence, but it also raised disturbing questions about what she had endured in her final hours. The dismemberment wasn't just about disposal, the methodical nature suggested someone who had experience with this kind of violence. The investigation now had a body and a crime scene, but it still needed a killer. The breakthrough came when investigators began to focus more intensively on the clients who had been frequenting the Casablanca bar. Police ultimately identified him as Joji Obara. Joji Obara was not what many might expect of a serial predator. He was wealthy, educated, and moved in sophisticated circles. But as investigators delved deeper into his background and activities, a disturbing pattern emerged that would shock even experienced detectives. When he was arrested, and after searching his apartment, they found over 400 videotapes showing him raping unconscious women. The scale of what they discovered was staggering. This wasn't a single crime of passion or even a planned murder, it was evidence of a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that had been going on for years. They also found a notebook in which he had written that he would dedicate himself to becoming evil. These weren't the impulsive actions of someone who had lost control, they were the calculated actions of someone who had consciously chosen to become a predator. As investigators continued to examine the evidence found at Obara's residence, an even more disturbing picture emerged. Police also found receipts for a chainsaw, cement, and a portable tent. These weren't random purchases, they were the tools of someone who had planned for disposal of evidence and had done so repeatedly. But Lucy Blackman wasn't Obara's only victim. When police later searched Obara's home, they found a diary entry that read, "Carita Ridgway, too much chloroform," and a videotape of Obara raping Ridgway. Carita Ridgway was an Australian woman who had died in 1992 under circumstances that had initially been ruled accidental. The discovery of Obara's diary entry and video evidence suddenly cast her death in a very different light. The phrase, "too much chloroform," suggested that Obara had been using drugs to incapacitate his victims, and that Ridgway's death had been the result of an overdose rather than murder per se, though the legal distinction mattered little to the victims. In October 2000, Obara was charged with the drugging, rape and murder of Blackman, as well as the manslaughter of Ridgway and the raping of 8 other women. The scope of his alleged crimes was breathtaking in its scale and calculated cruelty. Understanding Joji Obara requires understanding the privilege and resources that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. However, the 1990s recession caused him to lose his fortune. But even with reduced wealth, he had maintained the lifestyle and connections that gave him access to vulnerable women and the resources to cover his tracks. Obara's background was that of someone born to privilege who had used that privilege in the most destructive ways possible. He had the money to frequent expensive hostess bars, the connections to avoid scrutiny, and the resources to maintain properties where he could commit his crimes without fear of discovery. The wealth that should have been used for positive purposes had instead enabled years of systematic victimization. It's a reminder of how privilege can be corrupted and turned into a weapon against those with less power and fewer resources. Obara's trial started on July 4, 2001, 5 months after Blackman's body was found. What followed was a legal process that would span years and result in outcomes that satisfied no one completely. The trial of Joji Obara went on for 5 years, and in April 2007, he was found guilty and given a life sentence for the rape charges relating to the other victims. However, much to the horror of the Blackman family, the court found him not guilty of the charges against him in relation to Lucy. This verdict was devastating for the Blackman family. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the location of the body near Obara's property, his history of drugging and assaulting women, the evidence of systematic predatory behavior, the court found that the prosecution had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Obara had murdered Lucy specifically. The legal system had provided justice for some of Obara's victims but not for the victim whose case had generated the most attention. It was a stark reminder that legal proof and moral certainty don't always align. The story didn't end with the initial verdict. In March 2008, an appeal trial was held at the Tokyo High Court, and in December of the same year, Obara was found guilty of the abduction, dismemberment and disposal of Lucy Blackman's body. While this didn't constitute a murder conviction, it did acknowledge that Obara was responsible for what had happened to Lucy after her death. The Supreme Court of Japan rejected Obara's appeal in December 2010 and his life sentence became final. For the Blackman family, this represented a form of justice, even if it wasn't the complete vindication they had sought. Obara would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to harm any more women. The case of Lucy Blackman exposed uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and vulnerability in modern society. It showed how wealth and status could be used to exploit those seeking opportunity and adventure. It demonstrated the importance of persistent advocacy in the face of institutional indifference. And it revealed the complex realities of the global economy where young people travel far from home in search of experiences and opportunities. Lucy Blackman went to Tokyo as so many young people do, seeking adventure and new experiences. She found work that seemed to offer financial independence and the chance to immerse herself in a fascinating culture. But she encountered evil in a form that was both sophisticated and brutal. Her story serves as a reminder that predators often hide behind respectability and that the most dangerous people can be those who appear most trustworthy. It's also a testament to the power of family love and determination in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The neon lights of Tokyo continue to beckon young people from around the world, offering the promise of adventure and new beginnings. Most find exactly what they're looking for. But Lucy Blackman's story reminds us that even in the most modern and civilized societies, ancient evils can lurk just beneath the surface. Her memory lives on not just in the grief of those who loved her, but in the lessons her case taught about vigilance, justice, and the price of innocence in a complex world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Lucy Blackman not as a victim, but as a young woman who dared to chase her dreams across the world. Her story ended tragically, but her courage in seeking new experiences and her family's determination to find justice continues to inspire those who hear it. The case may be closed, but the questions it raised about safety, justice, and responsibility continue to resonate. In remembering Lucy, we honor not just her memory, but our commitment to protecting those who, like her, dare to venture beyond the familiar in search of something more. Rest well, knowing that justice, however complicated and incomplete, was ultimately served. And remember that even in the darkest stories, the love and determination of those left behind can shine as a light for others walking similar paths. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.